Good morning and welcome to American University inaugural AI Research Conference hosted by the Institute for Applied AI. Today marks an exciting milestone as we come together across schools and disciplines to explore the intersection of AI and research. I'm delighted to share that 200 people of AU community registered for this conference. I don't see 200 people right now here, but I'm sure they will come. But this strong turnout reflects our shared and collective interest driving our research community forward in the AI space. Throughout the day, you'll hear our leaders' opening remarks and then a keynote speech from the distinguished professor, and then 22 paper presentations, and then 2 panels, one panel with industry partners and one panel with faculty, exploring interdisciplinary research collaboration and also university industry collaboration as well. So big thank you to every presenter, every participant, every organizer who helped bring this conference to life, and also to each of you for investing your valuable time today with us. Also extend our appreciation to Phase 2 and then One Main Financial for their generous financial support and sponsorship. So now, unfortunately, Provost Vicki Wilkins just told me that she is sick home today, so she couldn't be here. She wanted to come here and share her remarks, but it's my pleasure to invite COGA Dean David Marchick to give us opening remark. Thank you.
Good morning, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm really excited about today. I'm mostly excited to learn and listen. I've got a seat in the back, and I'm gonna be in and out, but I hope to be here for 3 or 4 hours today. I know that at the AI teaching conference, which was in a smaller room where we ran out of seats, I sat in on maybe 15 of the presentations, and I just learned so much. And part of a dean's job is storytelling, is amplifying what faculty are doing across campus. So for me, this is just a great way to listen and... Okay, no, it's all right. Did I just... Oh, there's the bald guy. Okay. This is actually like 7 years old, but it's deteriorated from that point. So for me, this is just a wonderful opportunity to kind of listen to your stories and then be able to tell your stories. And for those of you who are not presenting, if you're faculty and you're doing something really cool or innovative with AI, shoot me an email, because I want to be able to talk about what you're doing. That's my job, and I actually derive a lot of joy from it. And as Julie will tell you, it's a great way to raise money as well to support your research. So the more I can learn, the more effective I can be, and the same for Julie as well. I'm really proud of what AU is doing in AI. It's just incredible. We launched this journey 4 years ago when the president of Google came and said that this was before ChatGPT blew up, that AI was going to be as profound as fire or electricity. And I listened and I thought, well, maybe that's hyperbole, but if it's 1/1,000,000th true, fire and electricity are pretty profound. And so we launched on a process to drive AI into everything we do at COGA. And today, 90% of our faculty are teaching with AI. 100% of our programs are infused with AI. We have AI majors, minors, certificates. And perhaps most importantly, it's infused across all of our disciplines. So if you're studying marketing, you're going to learn how to use AI to do fundamental research, to do A/B testing, to do what Jeff and Phase 2 does every day. If you're studying finance, you're going to learn how to underwrite investments using AI. It's incredible. Today's conference is focused on AI and research. And I think there are 2 important questions that I'm interested in learning about today. Number 1 is, can AI help accelerate research productivity at AU, responsibly and ethically? Actually, Professor Lee told me yesterday that AI is kind of helping him like a PhD student in some ways. that he can accelerate the amount of research, the quality of the research, and the speed using AI ethically and responsibly. The second is, can AI help us do a better job working across disciplines? Okay, this is one of the most difficult problems in academia. I'm new to academia. My COGOD colleagues will tell you that they suffer from my lack of knowledge of academia. But one of the things that I've observed here is just the stovepiping of academia and how that hurts research and how that hurts students. And if you think about what we're talking about today, learning AI and learning to be a professional and using research affects business, it affects policy, it affects international affairs, it affects the arts, it affects communication, it affects law. So it affects and education. It affects every part of American university. And so I'm hoping that this conference can also create opportunities to break down some of those barriers. I want to give Professor Lee credit in this regard. So for those who are not at COGOD, those at COGOD know that we evaluate faculty on 3 areas: research, teaching, and leadership service. Guan Ho kills it every year on all 3. He's like, the Winter Olympian gold medalist that doesn't fall in, after doing a quad. And he's just incredible. And he, with the AI Institute, along with Bay and Angela, they've broken through these barriers. So I think there are 20 or 30 faculty fellows. What's the number? 35. He keeps growing. Faculty fellows across AU. Okay. Not many initiatives can truly boast that they have faculty from every part of the university collaborating and working together. So thank you for your leadership. So I want to thank a few people. Jeff Walpole, who's CEO of Phase 2, he's an AU grad. He serves on the COGOD Advisory Committee. He's someone that's provided really important advice to us, particularly early in our process around this AI initiative. We were kind of uncertain, and we had a meeting with our advisory committee, and their message was run, don't walk. Run towards AI, embrace it. And use it as a differentiator, use it to help students, use it to accelerate research. So thank you, Jeff. You gave us confidence and energy to be able to do that. And then is Larry here? Larry Fitzpatrick, who's the Chief Technology Officer of OneMain Financial. You hear from him. He's on our digital advisory committee, and he also has been a key source of advice and strength, and also said, this is a great initiative, run, don't walk. And so we're running, and we're trying to stay ahead. And then Professor Zwicker, thank you very much. I'm really eager to hear you. He's one of the top faculty members and scholars at the University of Maryland, which obviously is an incredible school with great research strength. And he's going to talk about the use of computer vision and computer graphics to accelerate research productivity. And I'm basically data visualization. So I'm excited to learn. I don't really understand what he does, but I'll nod and pretend. Thank you very much for being here. I have the privilege of introducing Julie Marie Baldwin, who is a wonderful researcher, a leader. I think she may be, I don't know if I mess this up, she may be the top generator of grants on campus. She is, she's nodding, okay. And now she is serving in the role of Vice Provost of Research. We're starting to generate financial support for our AI work, and I seek her advice all the time. We actually have a couple big initiatives that we're working on, and she's just, if you all are seeking to generate research support, call her. She's incredible. In many ways, this function, I think, has, at a university, often is more of an impediment and an extra layer of bureaucracy. With Julie, it's the opposite. So I used to kind of avoid this part, and now I call her all the time because she's just great at it, and she's helpful, and she's here to amplify and accelerate this and not just add another layer of bureaucracy, which happens a lot at universities. So I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say that, but I said it. So welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I want to say good morning, and I'm looking forward to today. This is the first time that I'm going to be reading my notes off of my phone. I'm trying to be more tech savvy. We're going to see how this goes, but it's a pleasure to join you for the inaugural AAAI Research Conference. I hope that this is the first of many. Guanhu, you've done a wonderful job, all the organizers, and I'm really happy to see the room with colleagues and students from across the university who are leaning into the opportunities and challenges that AI presents for our research and our teaching. I want to begin by echoing what Guanhu said earlier, was that today represents nearly 200 faculty and graduate students. Not just in Kogod, not just in one school, but from physics to finance, from performing arts to public policy and law, are all gathered around the shared commitment to better understand, develop, and responsibly deploy AI. This is exactly also what I think an R1 university should look like in 2026. Curious, collaborative, and unafraid to tackle complex questions that cut across disciplines. If you know me, you know that I'm a huge proponent of collaboration and teamwork, especially collaborating across disciplines to identify and address challenges together. So one of the things that I find most exciting in the AI work being done here at AU is how it already spans across disciplines, and you're going to see this today. If you look at today's program, you see AI is being used to probe fundamental questions in cosmology, improve breast cancer recurrence prediction, advance trustworthy environmental science, and expand what is possible in sound design, film, and interactive media. You see scholars examining how AI shapes news consumption, negotiation and trust, policymaker communication, and even international arbitration. Taken together, this is a living illustration that AI is not owned by a single school, department, or domain. It is a connective tissue across our research enterprise at AU. That interdisciplinarity is not just interesting, but I believe it is essential. The technical advances in machine learning and large language models demand rigorous methods and theory, but the societal, ethical, legal, and economic implications demand that we bring multiple forms of expertise to the table. The questions raised in today's sessions about bias and hate speech, about competition and regulation in AI markets, about robot-proof skills and the future of work, about how people trust AI in health and financial decision-making, cannot be answered within a single discipline. They require computer scientists and social scientists, lawyers and business scholars, humanists and artists working together as genuine partners. As Interim Vice Provost for Research and Innovation, I see this conference as both a snapshot of where we are and a springboard for where we can go next. So my hope is that interdisciplinary collaborations are built today, and the ideas sparked today turn into sustained cross-campus efforts. That might look like new cross-school research teams forming around themes such as trustworthy AI, AI and democracy, AI in health and environment, or AI and creativity. Shared grant proposals that intentionally pair methodological innovators with domain experts and with scholars focused on ethics, equity, and policy. And more spaces, both formal and informal, where our students can learn what it means to be part of interdisciplinary AI research from the very start of their careers. The Office of Research is committed to helping you build and sustain those connections, whether that is through support for large multi-investigator proposals, seed funding for cross-disciplinary teams, or partnerships with industry and community organizations that want to work with AU on responsible and impactful AI. If you leave today with a new collaborator, a new idea for a project that bridges disciplines, or even just a new appreciation for how someone in a different field is thinking about AI, then this conference will have already done important work at our university. Thank you to our organizers, presenters, and all of you for your work that you're doing to shape AU's distinctive strengths in AI research and innovation. Dave, I was going to turn it back over to you, but I know we got a program switch up, so Guan Hu? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dean Dave, and then thank you, Vice Provost Julie. Appreciate it. So now I'd like to invite Professor Bei Xiao of Computer Science, also Associate Director of the AI Institute. She will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. I would have memorized this, but you will see soon why I cannot. So we're very delighted to invite Professor Matthias Zwicker from University of Maryland to give the keynote address for our founding research conference in AI. Professor Zwicker is the Elizabeth Arab Chair for Innovation and the Philip H. and Catherine C. Horwitz Professor, that's why, of Computer Science, and currently is the chair of the Department of Computer Science at University of Maryland. He's also the faculty member in UMD's Institute of Advanced Computer Science. So he joined UMD in March 17th as the Reginald Allen Hannon Endowed Innovate Professor in Computer Science. From 2008 and 17, Professor Zwicker is a faculty member in University of Bern in Switzerland, where he served as a head of computer graphics group and the director of undergraduate and graduate studies. He obtained his PhD from ETH Zurich in Switzerland, and between 2003 and 2008, he was also a postdoc associate at MIT. So Professor Zwicker's research has a huge impact in computer science, in the field of computer graphics and computer vision, with the goal of enabling next generation of image content in VR, AR, and computer graphic applications. This is, the birth bed for many of the most innovative AI research I want to shout out in the field of computer vision and graphics. So he's the conference chair for IEEE Eurographics Symposium and also paper chair for Eurographics and Eurographics Symposium on rendering. He has been a member of programming committee in the most major computer graphics conference, SIGGRAPH Asia, Eurographics, and the editor for prominent journals such as Computer Graphics Forum, IEEE TVCG, and the Visual Computer. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Matthias Zwicker to give the keynote address. Hope you enjoy it.
All right. Good morning. Thank you, Bei, for the very nice introduction. I can't remember all these long titles either myself, so no worries about that. So it's my great honor to be here this morning, all the way from College Park, and give this keynote address about AI. AI, especially in a computer science department, as chair of a computer science department, is at the top of my mind every day. It's almost everything that we talk about. And there's certainly also an enormous amount of hype and buzz, right, in the broader world about this. So in my talk today, I'm going to try to be a little bit broader than just focusing on my research. I'll show a few examples to illustrate some points from my area, but I'm really going to try to set the stage a little bit for what AI is and also limitations and what this means for working successfully with it. So the talk starts with this title, Is AI Real, and How to Work with It Successfully. And of course, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but there's so much hype about AI that sometimes I think we can ask ourselves, is it just that, just the hype, or is there something real? So I'm just really curious to see if I pose this question to you here. Is AI real, generally speaking? Raise your hand if you think that is true. All right, almost all the hands go up. That's fantastic. You really have to believe today, right? We heard it before. If you want to stay at the forefront, we have to take this for real. But maybe some of you wondered, what do we really mean with artificial intelligence? So if I were to tell you, what I really mean is are there artificial mechanisms, in computers that exhibit intelligence very much like we understand human intelligence? Who would say, yes, that exists? All right, some brave ones are still answering this question in affirmative, but much, much fewer people are doing this. So there is clearly a very big gap between, I think, right, this buzzword AI that we're talking about, that everyone thinks is real, but what we intuitively understand as human intelligence. So I really want to, dive a little bit into this gap and help you understand, where this gap is coming from and what it means for you to work with this technology successfully. All right, and to do this, we really have to look at a little bit of history, and I'm doing this because these ideas that I'm showing you here, they're not just history. This is actually, these are old ideas that are used pretty much one-to-one today in the most capable AI systems that are out there. So the first idea here is the idea of an artificial neuron. This is essentially the basic unit of computation that is used in AI systems, right? So this is a very simple mechanism that establishes an input-output relationship. So on the left, you have a few numbers, these weights, or these inputs, n inputs. These are just numbers. These numbers will be weighted with weights. That's a very important concept we'll keep talking about. And we'll compute the weighted sum that is then fed into a nonlinear function, okay? That's what an artificial neuron does, and it establishes this relationship between the inputs and the one output at the end through this weighted sum and a nonlinear function, right? So the weights here are really important because this is what we can adjust to control the type of input-output relationship that this calculates. So we are going to tweak these weights in the AI system to make it do what we want it to do, all right? So this basic mechanism is used exactly as I show it to you here in systems today, even though it was invented almost 100 years ago. Then the second really important idea that came a little bit later was the idea of multi-layer perceptrons. So essentially, this is the idea that neurons can be composed into larger computational structures using multi-layered networks. So we have a set of neurons. In a first layer, they're connected to a next layer, and so on. And all the neurons do their input-output, calculate their input-output relationships. So the idea to compose neurons into such networks is also very, very old, and that is fundamentally also how AI systems are built today. Then a next really, really important idea is the backpropagation algorithm. This is essentially an algorithm that allows you to train the network. That means to determine these parameter values, these weights that you see in red. And so we can do this to represent the desired relationship between input and output data through an entire big neural network. So the backpropagation algorithm allows us to do this not just for a single neuron, but when you stick them together in a network, we can still find these weights to model the input-output relationship that is evident in our data. All right, so if you need to know anything about the basic underpinnings of AI, remember these two pictures here. That is basically it, all right? It's really not much more complicated than this, and we have known about this, for the better part of 60 to 100 years. So later on, there were also some theoretical results that really showed that this mechanism, is in some way as powerful as computers in general can be. So there are universal approximators. We'll talk about this a little bit. And they're also Turing complete. So really, that means a neural network can do the same thing as a computer in general. All right? So based on this really simple but powerful idea based on the theory, it's kind of interesting that after the 70s, we went into a big, long AI winter. Basically, AI was not successful. If you were a researcher in computer science focusing on this type of AI, you could easily be considered a fringe person who is kind of a contrarian working on ideas that can be safely ignored. And that's what really happened. These ideas were safely ignored for a very, very long time. So things changed with this wake-up call that happened in 2012. And this was what was called AlexNet. So this is a neural network with 650,000 neurons. So we're talking about stacking a lot of neurons together. there were 60 million parameters, so 60 million weights on these connections in the neurons. And this network was constructed, it was in my research area. It was constructed to solve a computer vision problem. The problem is you give an image as input to the network, and as output, you would like to get a label that indicates the object that is in that image, like a cat, a dog, a car, and so on. So this network had a predefined set of 1,000 categories that it could recognize, and it was trained on a data set of 1.2 million images. So there were 1.2 million images paired with their corresponding labels, and that was the input-output relationship that the neural network was asked to replicate by basically tweaking these weights to produce the correct label for each image. So this really doesn't sound like artificial intelligence, right? Like this is a task that every human can do, and also many other animals, without thinking very much. But in computer vision, this was a huge breakthrough. And this system achieved the first place in a computer vision competition that's called the ImageNet Large Scale Visual Recognition Challenge. So this was the first time that this really broke through in computer science research. Before that, neural networks were a fringe idea. There were other techniques that led to much more successful results. And all of a sudden, this image, this technique from the 70s comes back. And people, this is really amazing, realized very, very quickly the huge potential in this idea. So from then on, it went extremely quickly. For example, just 5 years later, we got AlphaGo. You may remember this. That was the AI-based Go program that beat the best human player. Just 1 year later, AlphaFold came out. This is a system that is used to predict protein structures. And it was recognized with part of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2024. And then, of course, just a few more years later, ChatGPT came out. And this is really when the wider public became aware of AI. And as you all know, this is like the technology, the app that was adopted the fastest in history, 100 million users in no time. So very, very quickly, we went from these amazing achievements to very dire warnings also. So for example, Mustafa Suleyman, Microsoft's AI CEO, has said recently that white-collar work will be fully automated by AI within the next 12 to 18 months. So maybe that's a positive prediction because we can all go to the beach and relax. But there is also a flip side to this that turns dark very quickly. Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, said AI will probably most likely lead to the end of the world. But in the meantime, there will be great companies. And of course, that's what he seems to be interested in most of all. And another one is this book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. This is by Eliezer Yudkowsky and Nate Soares. These are two respected thinkers in this area. So the question is really, how did we go within the short time span of just 20 years from a practically useless thought experiment to the possible end of the world that has been prophesized here? So this is really a question that I want to investigate a little bit and show you the shortcomings of this, but also the benefits. So what is AI conceptually? And I think this here is a very good summary at a somewhat humoristic level. So this is your machine learning system. Yep, you put the data into this big pile of linear algebra, then collect the answers on the other side. What if the answers are wrong? Just stir the pile until they start looking right. So I think the spirit of this captures this quite well. But I want to describe it a bit more technically also. So technically, neural networks are what are called universal function approximators. So that's a mathematical concept that can be proven rigorously. And that basically says that neural networks are big sequences of basic mathematical operations. We'll call this an AI model. And these models can, in principle, represent relationships between any set of input and output data. You give it the input, you give it the output, you ask it to establish the relationship, map the input to the output. It can do it with any type of data that you give it, in principle. That's a universal function approximator. In addition, neural networks are parametric functions. That means the same computational structure, so the same set or sequence of mathematical operations, the same model, can be trained to represent different input-output relationships. So this is the process where you tweak the weights when you give it data, and it will adjust the weights to map your specific input data set to the output, right? So this makes it very, very useful because you don't have to redesign your computational structure every time. You just have to tweak these weights, and you can approximate the relationship you want. So maybe some of you are thinking now, well, this sounds an awful lot like regression. You have input, independent variable, you have output, dependent variable. You fit a model to it, right? So yes, for example, linear regression. Let's say you have the problem, you have house sizes, you have prices, and you want to fit a model that predicts, given the house size, the price. So this would be a one-dimensional regression problem where your input and output, they just are one number, and we're using a pretty simple model that only has two parameters, the slope and the intercept, right? So the benefit of this, it's very easily interpretable. You immediately understand roughly what the relationship is. So the question is, how is this really different from what AI is doing? So the difference in the regression problem that AIs are solving is really that the data is very different. In AI, we can work with highly complex, very high-dimensional input and output data, like images, video, language, audio, weather data, and so on. So that means, for every data point, one number is not enough to describe it. But you'll need hundreds, thousands, or even millions of numbers to capture a single data point, right? Like an image or a piece of text. With AI, you can feed those data points in their raw form into the system, rather than having to manually think about, what are the features, what are the important numbers, metrics about this data that I want to capture. You can feed the raw data. And you can do this with huge amounts of input-output sample pairs that you use for training the model. So maybe the most famous example for a regression problem in AI is basically the problem of constructing a large language model. So this technically is simply a large multinomial logistic regression. That's what it is. But in practice, when you look at it, it's a bit more impressive. So for example, a large language model really can map any question formulated in English about anything or any prompt to a corresponding answer, also again in English. But technically, that's a multinomial logistic regression problem. And this is run one word at a time. So the regression really predicts only one next word in this regression problem, right? So this is kind of amazing that you can do this. And the question is really, like, what changed since the 70s that makes this work today? Because the basics were clearly around, as I showed you. And the answer here, unfortunately, is not about intelligence or doing something very smart. It is simply about scale. Everything got bigger. We have faster computers. We have more memory. We have more data. And scale is what makes AI work. So this is what has been described in what are called scaling laws. And these are really empirical observations. They basically relate, in the plot that I'll show you, increasing amounts of computation that you put into training, so tweaking the weights. They relate this to the increasing accuracy of the model. So for a language model, given an input text, a prompt, the accuracy of predicting the correct next word, okay? So this is basically a proxy for model size, for how many weights there are in the model. So if you do this with a relatively small model, then the accuracy will go down initially when you start tweaking the weights, but it will plateau relatively quickly. The model doesn't have enough degrees of freedom, and it can't make accurate predictions for a large amount of data. But what we're now going to do is we're going to do this experiment with larger and larger models, which means, with neural networks, this is very simple to do. We can just add more neurons. We make the layers wider, and we stack more layers on top of each other. So scaling is trivial almost with neural networks. So as you do this, what you will observe is something like this. So from left to right, the blue lines are models with more and more parameters, larger and more neurons. And you see that as you train these longer, the accuracy can be increased. And you can fit this neat little straight line to it. And if you continue, the accuracy will simply get better and better and better forever, as you see according to this line. So unfortunately, the line is not really, the scale here, as you can see, is not a linear scale. So this is not really a line that if you double your effort, you double your accuracy. That's not quite how it works. It requires much more effort. But fundamentally, it works, and it has continued working until today. So similar scaling laws also can be observed for the amount of training data. When you increase that, it scales up similarly. So this led to a formidable model size arms race. So here you have model size on the vertical axis, again, proxy for training computation, and on the horizontal axis you have time. And you see how this has gone up continuously. And again, this is not a linear plot. Observe that the vertical axis is a factor of 10 for every step. So basically every year, the size of these models has gone up by a factor of I think around 4 to 6 or something like this, right? Like massive acceleration in terms of model sizes. So I want to demonstrate what this really means in practice using an example from my research area, and this is image or video generation. So these networks, they basically learn to map random vectors, so vectors with random numbers, to images. Here, it's basically just low resolution images of random faces. That's what the network is asked to do, map any random vector of numbers into an image of a face, pretty low resolution. So this network here was proposed in 2014, about 4 million parameters, about 100,000 images to train it. And it kind of works, but it's not fantastically impressive, right? This paper, by the way, has more than 100,000 citations. It's one of the most famous papers in AI on generative adversarial networks. And it was just the beginning. So today, we have something like this, and you may have seen this video.
You killed Jeffrey Epstein, you animal! He was a good man!
He knew too much about our Russia operations. He had to die, and now you die too.
Right, so very realistic, totally fake. This is simply scaling up image generation. So here the input is a text description and also a random vector. So somebody gave the system a very simple prompt. The output is a high-resolution video, also including audio. And this is the CDance 2.0 model. This video just, maybe you've heard about it in the news, just came out a few days ago. This has about 20 billion parameters. It's by ByteDance. This is the parent company that owns TikTok. They have, of course, a lot of video data through their platform. It was trained on between 15 and 30 billion video frames. That's an estimate. This is not something that they disclose. So scaling, leads to very, very, very qualitatively different results. Another example that I want to show you is a benchmark that is used to evaluate large language models. This is called Humanity's Last Exam. You may laugh, but once you see the questions, you'll realize that you won't pass the exam. So this, consists of expert-level questions designed by PhDs. They're Google-proof. You cannot simply Google the answers. So it's not in the training data. It's about 2,500 questions across multiple disciplines. So these are, text questions mostly that are put as input into a language model. Output is supposed to be the correct answer. So let's look at one of the examples. The set of natural transformations between two functors, f, g, mapping c to d, can be expressed as the end. And now, we're starting to guess how to interpret the symbols that follow. So, the average human can't even understand the question. Very few humans will be able to answer it correctly, unless you're a specialist and probably a math grad student, right? So these are really tricky questions in this benchmark, and this is what happens when you do scaling to try to answer these questions better and better. This timeline is just from November 24 to pretty much now. You see, a little more a year and a half ago, the best models were quite bad, less than 10% correct questions. Today, we're at about 40% correct answers in this benchmark. I have two models from Google here. One from 2025, that was Gemini 2.5. That has between 128 and 300 billion parameters again, but these numbers aren't really disclosed exactly. And this compares to 1.2 trillion parameters for Gemini 3. So again, scaling is really the key reason why this works better and better. There are some other reasons, but scaling is really what matters. So, why does scaling work? That scaling is simply an empirical observation, but why it works is far less clear. There are some hypotheses and intuitions. One of them is essentially to realize that intelligence is buried in the complexity of the training data. So, given complex training data, even a simple task like outputting the next word, if you need to do this for a complex universe, like all text ever written, for all text ever written, you need to be able to predict the next word with the highest possible accuracy. Then you can only do this if you actually deeply understand the text in the input, which you could say it's not possible without intelligence. This is also related to, again, a theory or intuition that is often called the compression as intelligence. So of course you could think a model can simply memorize all the outputs that it needs to produce, right? It has so many degrees of freedom that it should be able to do this. But there is in fact not enough memory in these models to memorize everything. The training data is simply bigger than the number of knobs that you can adjust. So because of this, models need to discover and leverage regularities, structures, relationships in data to produce the right output. And if you have huge models and huge amounts of training data, then highly abstract concepts will emerge. Like the model will start to in some way understand those concepts to make the right prediction. So for example, you could think, and these are kind of hypothetical examples, if you want to predict words about gravity, then you need to model an approximation of physics. Or if you want to predict words about a person's feeling, then you need to build a theory of mind to understand what's going on in a text. And then you can provide the next word prediction better. So these are really theories. There's some solid mathematics to talk about parts of it, but largely it's just that theories. But there is a really, really active research area these days that basically tries to empirically extract evidence of this sort of abstract understanding from a trained AI model. So this is almost like neuroscience for trained AI models, or psychiatry or psychology for trained AI models. So people are trying to be creative in terms of trying to extract this from trained models. And I want to show you an example for what this means, again, from my research area. So the goal here is basically we would like to understand the concept of a beard, of having a beard, for image editing. So let's say facial images, and we want to understand the concept of adding beards to facial images. Right. So this sounds like a toy problem, but I think it's interesting to visualize this. So in a naive approach, you could say, well, let's interpret the image as an array of pixels. That's how it's stored in a computer, right? Just an array of numbers, red, green, and blue for every pixel. So this is essentially, an array is a matrix, right? So we're doing linear algebra here, and we have a matrix, or you can also interpret it as a long 1D vector for an image, and we're going to represent the beard in exactly the same way, okay? And this is also a long vector, so we can do linear algebra, simply add these two together very concretely, okay? And what you will get is, a picture of that person with the beard. So not bad, but clearly, we can spot that this is not real right away, and we would have to, manually like scaled the beard and shifted it to the right place, right? It's not totally automatic. For every picture, you would have to do this manually. So, this representation of the image is not compressed. We just have the raw data interpreted directly in terms of linear algebra, and this doesn't work well. Now, if you do this with neural networks, you can do something like this. I'm going to represent, the same image, but now as a neural network. A neural network is just given by the vector of its weights. I'm going to construct a network that can represent all images of this person, not just this one image, right? But there is like one input to the network that will produce exactly this image, okay? But overall, the network is a compressed representation of all images of this person. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something similar with the concept of beard. I'm going to represent this as the difference between the neural network weights for basically all images with beards and all images without beards. So, this separation is done manually, but the network itself, when it was trained, didn't know anything about beards, right? I didn't tell it to pay attention to beards in any way. But after it's trained, I separate out, the networks for images with beards and the ones without, and I take the difference between these. So I have a single sort of difference vector of weights that applies, that should apply to all the images. So now I do linear algebra with these weights, and I just take the weights for images of that person, and I add the weights for beards. And I get, a perfect image of that person with a beard. So somehow, this vector for beards that I extracted from the trained model understands the concept in a deep way. It can apply it exactly right to the image that I showed it. And of course, this doesn't only work with beards. You can do this with many other properties too. So, here, being balder, or adding beard, and so on. Here's another example, making someone more chubby, adding mustache, big eyes, balding. So the network clearly, somehow captured many concepts, many degrees of variation that you can see in human faces. And here's another example, and it also applies, to images that aren't necessarily photographs. Right, so this is the idea of the network, because of the amount of data that it has seen and the need to compress, that it can extract these really, abstract concepts. So another question that I want to talk about very briefly is, why do we need neural networks for this? Because mathematically, there are many ways to construct universal function approximators that can basically do what I said in the beginning. But there is something special about neural networks. There's theory that shows that they have a very good inductive bias. That basically means that the structure of the computation leads to desirable representations of the input-output relationships. And desirable really means that the relationships that are captured are as simple as possible. And there's recent research that investigates this very deeply, and can show that essentially neural networks have an inbuilt Occam's razor to arrive at the simple relationships that can model your data. Even if your model has too many parameters for what you want to model, it will find a simple solution. And that is absolutely not true for other such function approximators. The other advantage of these networks is really practical. And this is that the computation that is executed in the networks can be efficiently performed on powerful modern parallel processors. So for example, the latest generation of processors from NVIDIA name maybe that you have heard, can do 18 petaflops per petaflop. So what is that? A petaflop is 1 million times 1 billion floating point operations per second, so additions, multiplications, and so on. This is an absolutely staggering number. I don't even know what that means. But apparently it's necessary, right, to run computations this large to acquire these capabilities through scaling. Right. So, you could say, well, fantastic. This technology is really the magic that we need that can solve everything. But there are a few pitfalls that I would like to point out that are really important in terms of working with it. So one key issue is hallucination. This is the fact that neural networks can produce input-output pairs that seem totally inconsistent with the training data. So 2 days ago, when I prepared this talk, I went to Google search, clicked on AI mode, and asked it to give me a brief synopsis of the paper called Responsible Use of AI in Academic Research by Zwicker et al. And without hesitation, it produced this output here that sounds very, very reasonable. But of course, I did not write this paper, unfortunately. So, and this is right now, right? So if you go to Google AI mode, this may not be accurate. And this is really a reason why a lot of people dismissed large language models, and they hallucinate, they're useless. I have to say that, well, on one hand, you can say that this is a feature, actually, not a bug. And one can show, this paper showed that for any output that you provide, any natural language output, you can actually find an input that produces that output, right? So the network is somehow not limited to the correct answers, but you can tweak it to provide any output. So this is, of course, a big question in how to use it. But there are various strategies to reduce hallucinations in modern LLMs, right? So they cannot be completely prevented, but there are many techniques that work much better than what I just showed you. So for example, when you go to ChatGPT, same question, unfortunately, this guy realized that I didn't write the paper, but helpfully proposes basically to write the paper for me. So this is definitely great. What you will see here is that it says start for 11 seconds. So the difference here is that this is not a one-shot, prediction in terms of regression, but essentially the model kind of talks to itself to try to check that the answer is correct. The flip side of hallucinations are also called adversarial examples. So these are essentially carefully created inputs that are designed for the AI to make mistakes. So often you can change an input in a way that is not noticeable for a human, and the model will give a completely wrong answer. So this is an example, again, from computer vision. It's this image recognition problem, picture of a panda. The picture is supposed to be classified, correct label is panda. In adversarial examples, what one can show is that it's possible to change this picture just a little bit by adding some random noise. So the random noise is actually scaled down very much so that visibly, it's not really visible in the final image. But this noise pattern was designed intentionally to fool the neural network to produce a wrong output, and indeed it will then classify this as a given. So of course this is like hugely problematic in practical applications if networks are susceptible to these what are called adversarial attacks. Other issues are data set bias. AI models basically, they treat statistical skews in your training data simply as ground truth. When you put the data to the model to train the model, there's no way that the model can question your training data. It will simply try to establish this input-output relationship. And here's an example from image generators where the prompt is a childcare worker, and you see that you get very stereotypical and biased results for the types of people that the model has associated with childcare workers. And this can have a more enormous real-world impact, for example, in healthcare, recruiting, or law enforcement, where there were some spectacular failures, right, where facial identification basically went wrong due to racial bias in the data that was used to train the systems. So this is really important to keep in mind. Data privacy and confidentiality, a huge problem also. This is a case from a hospital in Ontario a couple of years ago. Basically what happened, there was a doctor's meeting on Zoom. This was inadvertently recorded by an AI-powered transcription tool. That tool had access to the meeting because there was a former doctor who had used his or her personal email in their calendar invite. So through the personal email, the AI transcription tool was launched, and then after the meeting sent out notes to all the participants, and that included the former employee. So basically big breach of confidentiality. There's a human error in here because the former employee wasn't allowed by policy to use their personal email in that calendar invite, right? But because they did, the confidentiality was broken. This is also called the trifecta of AI agent risk. So this is when you have basically private data, the doctor's conversation. You have untrusted access to untrusted data. Here, this was the private email. That wasn't negligence. It wasn't an attack. And the ability for the AI to communicate externally. If these three factors are there, basically, doom is almost guaranteed that problems will appear. And finally, when you do research, there are a few things to keep in mind. And I think when we think about AI, we think about data analysis. But AI by itself is really not your superior statistical data analysis tool that can replace your well-established techniques. That is not what it is. As a statistical technique, AI is mostly just regression, right? But of course, the large language models, they will be, without complaining, they will spit out R code, S+ code, whatever code you want to run and generate your statistical analysis. Then you better double check that that code does what you think it's doing. But for that, it's certainly very helpful. So to work successfully with AI, you really have to keep these weaknesses in mind. So it's important, crucial, to maintain epistemic authority. So the human, in the end, needs to make the decisions about claims, about novelty, contributions, and so on. AI output should be treated as drafts because of problems like hallucination. Humans should be kept in the loop to be able to check the output of AI. So these are direct consequences of these issues: hallucinations, privacy problems, data set skew, things like that. I think those are the most important ones. But of course, AI is incredibly useful and can be leveraged for many things like exploration in your research, interactive brainstorming with an AI, literature research, analysis, or pilot studies using silicon subjects. So you can use a language model basically to impersonate an actor and build, let's say, an agent-based model. But it's probably at this point safer to treat this as a pilot study rather than claiming this as your final result. AI is great for execution of tedious tasks with large amounts of data that are structured, well-defined, and where you can verify results. So for example, deductive data coding using a given codebook, that is a good example. And you can have add mechanisms to that process to verify the results. And of course, generating computer code, as I mentioned, great example. So to conclude this talk, I think we have to really acknowledge that today, or maybe tomorrow, AI can process many types of complex information, text, image, video, and so on, as well or better than humans. I think that is a reality that comes from basically scaling up models and data size. I didn't talk about reasoning and agentic techniques, but these are techniques that have led to further boost in performance over sort of this one-shot generation and really have further increased the capabilities of these systems. That said, there are some areas where AI really still lags. right? Like autonomous systems, autonomous cars, things like that, robots that work autonomously, they're still not quite there. So these require multimodal reasoning, and that's an area where there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. So, final remark, to work successfully with AI, you do need to be aware of the pitfalls and take mitigation strategies. I think that is very, very crucial to keep in mind, but it also means that, at least for now, we are still important when we do research. Thank you.
We have time for only one question.
I just have a very quick question. It's very inspiring. What do you think of the role of neuroscience in improving AI and alignment of human reasoning?
Right, that is an excellent question. I think, first of all, I would be depressed if I were a neuroscientist, because now we have these systems where we know every single calculation that happens in them. We know everything about them, but still,
Yes.
we fail really to understand how they work. So as a neuroscientist, of course, the problem is much, much bigger, because you don't even have full information about what is happening. I think that's one part of the answer. The other part is that a lot of these developments, they are somewhat loosely inspired by biology, of course, but they really have been driven by, through computer science and engineering. They haven't been driven by somehow better understanding how biological systems work and better mapping this into artificial systems. That is not how progress has been achieved. Progress has simply been achieved by scaling up and then experimenting with those artificial systems.
Great, thank you.